Hi everyone, this is Paul, and this is a bonus episode of Legendary Adventures, a Legend of Zelda playthrough podcast. I'm taking some time to get things set up for the next season, which will focus on Phantom Hourglass. But I don't want to leave you without a new episode, so I've prepared a few bonus episodes that will hopefully carry us through to the next season. This week we're going to be talking about how Zelda Dungeons are made. This episode will use a February 2015 article from Kotaku as a jumping off point. Stephen Totilo asked Zelda series producer Eiji Aonuma directly about how Zelda Dungeons are designed. He gave some general answers, and I'll try to supplement his answers with some additional information from other interviews with developers of the Zelda series. In the interview with Kotaku, Aonuma described the overall process of designing a dungeon this way. The first thing that we ask ourselves when we're designing a new dungeon is what sort of gameplay do we want the player to engage with, and that will help us decide on a kind of theme for that dungeon. For example, are we trying to build a dungeon around puzzle-type gameplay, or is action more the focus? And once we've decided on a theme along those lines, we'll start to think about how a player might use a particular item in that dungeon to interact with the environment. Up until this point, all of that is kind of laying out the theory of what kind of dungeon this is going to be. And from that point, we move on to implementation. So, that's the general outline of how a Zelda dungeon is designed. As to who is designing the dungeons, that depends on which game and even which era of Zelda we are talking about. Aonuma outlined in his interview with Kotaku that early on, there was typically one dungeon designer on a project. But as the series progressed, the team grew larger, and that responsibility was divided up among multiple people. At any rate, we know the process starts with a designer. Speaking at the Game Developers Conference in 1999, Zelda series co-creator Shigeru Miyamoto described the role of a game designer this way. You'll hear the voice of his translator.
I've at last come to the conclusion that the role of a game designer is to design a complete game system by first comprehending the technologies that will enable and realize that system.
Miyamoto says designers need to have an idea of the strengths and limitations of the machines they are designing for, in order to know how to best convey their ideas to players. First, however, the ideas need to be conveyed to the programmers who will realize them. To do this, the developer writes and draws up specifications, or specs for short. Miyamoto provided an example of what he felt was good and bad specification writing. Listen.
Suppose a designer offers the following specification for an action game.
敵は主人公をランダムにサーチする。
The enemy will randomly search the actions of the player character.
で、ランダムにサーチするっていうのはものすごく仕様のように聞こえるんですけれども、このままではプログラムは組めませんよね。
Of course, randomly search sounds like it's an authentic specification, but the programmer can't put something like this into code.
で、開発がずっと進んでいった後で、そのどこの部分を変えると理想の形に近づくのかはデザイナーはわからないわけです。
And later on in the game, the designer's not going to know where to begin tinkering to try and get that game back towards its original concept.
で、例えばどうでしょう。敵は30ゲームフレームに一度プレイヤーの向きに方向を変える。そしてその3回に1回はそうじゃない方向を適当に向く。これならどうでしょう。
But what if the following specification was presented? The enemy shall change course based on character movement once every 30 game frames. And 1 in 3 times, it will randomly select a direction to progress in.
で、さっきよりも随分プログラマーは作り始めやすいですよね。そしてそれがうまくいかないときにどこを直せばいいかということがゲームデザイナー自身にも分かるわけです。
This second example should be more easily programmed than the first. And later on, when problems appear, we have an idea of where to begin modifying it.
Programmer Kazuaki Morita offered some insight from the programmer's perspective and how they work with the designers to realize a final concept. In a 2005 article for Nintendo Power, released in the lead-up to Twilight Princess, he initially compared it to construction writing. A programmer's job is to program the ideas and designs created by the game designers. In other words, it's our job to follow the blueprint laid down by the designers and actually build the building. Morita stated the shift between 2D and 3D design also fundamentally changed the way the programming happened as well. He then compared it to cooking, saying that programmers follow the recipe but add spice where needed to really bring the designs and ideas to life. He said, depending on the specs given by the programmer, they may have to add more spice to fully form the idea. But he said for ideas that already came well seasoned, the programmer's work becomes more about preserving that unique seasoning, as they make it all work together. He then shared this example. When we programmed The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, most elements of that game were already seasoned to an excellent level when they were delivered to us. On the other hand, a few things in The Wind Waker, do you remember the puppet Ganon marionette creature in Ganon's Tower, were seasoned heavily during programming. Since I was very focused on enemy programming in The Wind Waker, I found a few ways to bring Puppet Ganon to life with just the right pinch of this and that. What the specifications look like will vary based on the game, when it was made, and whether it was a 2D or 3D project. In 2009, programmer Toshihiko Nakago shared design documents, including the very first specs drawn up for the original Legend of Zelda. As I detailed in my revisit of the development of The Legend of Zelda, the project originally only featured dungeons. The dungeons were entered via a select screen. The first specs seem to outline that plan, with an entrance drawn inside a box. An arrow then points up from that box to another box labeled First Floor. There are then 4 additional boxes to the right of the first floor box labeled Floors 2 through 5, and they're all connected by arrows. Another design document made only a couple of weeks later shows designs for a number of enemies, items, and obstacles. Many of them are recognizable and appear in the final game. Aonuma and the late Nintendo president Satoru Iwata noted these specs as being the source material for the games that followed. Series co-creator Takashi Tezuka laid out the dungeons as we know them today in the original Legend of Zelda. The dungeons for that game employ a modular dungeon design. As Tezuka noted in an Iwata Asks interview in 2009, basically, we were going to make lots of dungeons using 1 square per room, and lay them out like a jigsaw puzzle. All the dungeons were designed to interlock together in order to save space. Tezuka drew up all his dungeon designs on graph paper, showing how they will interlock together, and also drawing up the more detailed designs of rooms and things on graph paper as well. When it comes to his work designing dungeons, Aonuma told Kotaku in 2015 he did the original layout for all the dungeons of Ocarina of Time. In 2017, he shared some of his specs from Ocarina of Time during a conversation with Dragon Quest producer Jin Fujisawa, which was published on Denfami Nico Gamer. We don't get as clear a view from the photos as we do of the specs that were shared in the Iwata Asks interview, but we do get to see them fairly well. They're a mix of designs and written specifications done with the aid of a computer program, and there's also a few pages of handwritten specs. The water temple is mentioned specifically in the conversation, and we can in the photos see a diagram rendered using the aid of a computer that shows the layout of a room with simple boxes used to represent the room and the objects inside. The diagram seems to show the interior of the central tower of the water temple, with notes showing how a block will float from the bottom up to reveal a new path when the water level is raised. We can also see mapped out diagrams of the inside of Jabu Jabu's belly, showing the forking path near the tail of the dungeon and the tentacles that players need to destroy in order to advance. Aonuma also pointed out footnotes that he placed to convey what he was aiming for, as well as brainstorming ideas to the programmers. He even mentioned that he would sometimes describe sound effects in order to really get his ideas across. During that conversation, he said, "I joined the project to make dungeons. At that time, I just made whatever I came to think of. It was a kind of time where once you were in charge of things, then you have to come up with the result. There was nobody but me who could make the dungeons, so everything was up to me. So I've got to surprise people as much as I wanted." Aonuma noted he attempted to put teases and baits into his designs, such as showing the boss door near the beginning of the dungeon and then having players eventually loop back to that point as the dungeon progressed. In addition to the design specs and programming, art is needed to pull the entire dungeon concept together. There are many artists who work on Zelda games. The number of artists working on a title have increased as the series has progressed. As with the designers, there are multiple artists working on the dungeons in the game. Artist Shinko Takeshita described her role in creating Twilight Princess's Forest Temple in a 2006 article for Nintendo Power. She wrote, "My job is to take the ideas of the game planner and visually bring the game's dungeons to life. The general information is provided by the planner. Things like the type of environment, item locations, and the overall dungeon shape. And then it's up to me to make it look good." Takeshita majored in industrial design in college, and she says those skills come in handy with her job as an artist at Nintendo. She wrote, "Knowing the basics of design helped me on many occasions, such as when I needed to properly balance the color palette, or when I needed to decide what shapes to use." According to Takeshita, she was only in charge of the Forest Temple, while other artists handled other dungeons in Twilight Princess, though she noted they would occasionally cross over and help each other. She wrote, "I helped out with graphics in other areas, and other graphic designers helped me out with the dungeon I was working on. It's nice when I get a chance to play the outdoor areas. It gets claustrophobic just working on dark and narrow passages all the time. Maintaining the proper balance between gameplay in the field and in the dungeons is an important part of Zelda games." That covers the basics of how Zelda Dungeons are made, in a general sense. In his 2015 interview with Kotaku, Aonuma noted the process that he described covered the basics of how they were designing dungeons pre-Breath of the Wild. He noted, however, "Something that's really important to us now is that we feel it's important to challenge the orthodoxy of the Zelda series as we're creating new games. So while we still need to look for some themes early on, we do want to look at interesting ways to make departures from the rest." That's it for this week's episode of Legendary Adventures Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to subscribe if you want to keep following along with this podcast. And to everyone who has already subscribed, thank you. You are awesome. I'm Paul Riley, and I will see you next week.